One of the most interesting things about the history of the reception of Intolerance is how consistent it's been over nearly 100 years. A lot of the reviews in the teens, although they varied widely, talk about the film's complexity, the way in which it has expanded the vocabulary of film, the ways in which it is obviously an achievement in the development of filmmaking, while at the same time talking about how complicated it is, how difficult it is to follow. And there is this sense that this is a kind of an admirable experiment that maybe isn't quite as successful as Griffith intended it to be. And I think for modern viewers, we often find those reviews very strange to read, in the sense that it still feels a bit like that. We can see this tremendous expansion of film vocabulary. We can see why this film is so wonderful in so many ways, but it also is still quite difficult to follow, even to viewers who are used to the codes of silent film. And it can be a challenge in lots of ways, even though it obviously has its pleasures. When you read reviews of the film in the middle of the century, in the 1940s and 50s, when film culture is developing, film is beginning to be shown in museums, particularly MoMA in New York, and there are film clubs sprouting up all over the place, all over North America. Intolerance is one of those films that is important in the early canon building of film appreciation and what it will eventually become film studies. That and Birth of a Nation are sort of twin pillars, nearly sibling films, often shown together, written into the same programs to demonstrate key points in the history of the development of cinema. Because film was not necessarily recognized as an art by everyone, and in a world where there was still quite a strong distinction between high art and low art, film needed masterpieces, it needed a canon, and Intolerance was a key part of that. So there are a lot of really great film club programs from the 1950s that I've seen in my research that describe the film and in incredible detail and talk a lot about the ways in which it has expanded the vocabulary of cinema making, recognizing its importance and future influence, at the same time recognizing that it's challenging and very different than other films of the time and different in lots of ways than Griffith's other work. When we think about the reception of Intolerance or the history of Intolerance in relation to Griffith's other best-known film, The Birth of a Nation, in some ways their reception history is exactly the opposite. With The Birth of a Nation, the content is deplorable to modern eyes. The extreme racism is barely palatable and overpowers any other kind of reaction to the film. But the structure of Birth of a Nation, a long, sweeping historical epic set against a major point in history with a love story to connect us to it, is recognizable in its basic form as modern epic filmmaking. Titanic is basically the same structure. And so with Birth of a Nation, that structure has survived, even though the content is thankfully not something that we support or recognize anymore. With Intolerance, it's almost exactly the opposite, that the message, thankfully, of sort of peace and human kindness seems much more palatable. But the structure seems much stranger, even though pieces of the film, of the individual stories, the basic narrative and storytelling structure is influential in the history of narrative filmmaking. This idea of telling four stories and cutting back and forth between them has not been as influential in Hollywood. It's generally not the way we tell stories, and it can still make the film feel very much like a road not taken.